Hello and welcome to another one of my videos. I'm Amoni Panala. My pronouns are she, her. This is a class video. This is part of the core class curriculum for EVE University for the game EVE Online. Um, this is intended to provide recorded classes. I constantly get asked, uh, are you going to have a recording of this class? And my answer is always no. I don't like the idea of recording actual classes because people ask questions and they might feel self-conscious about asking those questions, and I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable about asking those questions and maybe uncomfortable or concerned about whether or not they're going to be put in the spotlight by asking a question. So I never want to record those classes because I'm always concerned that it'll make someone uncomfortable. So this is a recording to provide those classes for people. I'm working my way through the entire collection of classes that we have, our core classes and recommended classes, as well as some classes that I recorded, or rather, classes that I designed or reworked. Um, there are a lot more classes that we don't teach on the regular, but are available for instructors and teachers to use. As a teacher, an FC, and a mentor, I feel like it's important to have as much reference material as possible. So I thought it was important to create video recordings of classes. Of course, this information can become outdated because the game changes over time. So be aware that some of this information may be outdated depending on when you watch it. Today's class is Introduction to Dscan. So today we're going to talk about what the Dscan is, using your Dscan, including how to set it up with your overview, how to look at the map, adjusting your range and angle, why you might do that, the uses of Dscan, and although this class is not recorded in front of a class, you are encouraged to ask questions in the comments to this video, and I will try to answer as many of them as is possible for me to do so. Can't promise that I'll answer all of them, but I will try to get to as many as possible. So what is Dscan? Dscan stands for Directional Scanner. Uh, every ship, including pods, has a directional scanner. This is essentially your sonar in space, right? If you've ever watched, K-19 Widowmaker, Hunt for Red October, all these really cool submarine movies, you've heard the little ping noise that comes out in submarines. I'm sure some of you may have actually been on a submarine and know that that's not how it actually sounds, but you know, um, this is your sonar in space, and it gives you a bunch of helpful information for knowing what is around you. It allows you to increase your situational awareness, um, and by default, it is linked to your overview presets. This is called your active overview filters. Um, you don't have to train any skills to be able to use it. There are no skills that improve its efficacy. It just works. But it is something that you will have to practice using, and you will have to play around with the settings to get it to a way that you like it, right? So one of the most basic quality of life things that you can do is set up the scan button to a preset that you use regularly, something that you can hit regularly, easily, and repeatedly. So for example, I have a basic gaming mouse. One of my extra mouse buttons is the Dscan button. I can hit that several times a minute if I need to. Consider doing something similar. You can use this whether you're cloaked or uncloaked, but be aware that if you are cloaked, it will not show, other ships will not appear if they are cloaked. Um, there are some ships that don't appear on Dscan. That is a feature of that ship. So just be aware of that. Um, Ships on Dscan and in general objects on Dscan only show up to 14.3 AU. That is the limit of your Dscan range, 14.3 AU. As a general rule, you cannot warp to things from Dscan. The exception would be structures. You can warp to structures from Dscan, but that's about it. So if you see a ship on Dscan, if you see an MTU, whatever the case may be, you're not going to be able to warp to it from Dscan. If you want to get to that thing, whatever it is on Dscan, you're going to need to narrow down where it is. We'll talk about how to do that. Or you will need to use combat probes. Now, in order to get this set up, you are going to need to open your Dscanner, and that's going to be on your HUD, right? You can see in my example picture, there's a little, it looks like a sensor readout. You're going to click that right next to your capacitor, and then it's going to bring up a contextual radial menu. And you're going to see one that kind of looks like a Wi-Fi signal. And you're going to click that one. That's going to bring up your, that's going to bring up a big map, and it's also going to have your directional scanner. And you're going to want to undock that directional scanner. I'll show you that in a minute here. There are ways to get at it from the Neocom if you want. You can go into your Neocom, which is the little E. It looks kind of like a hamburger menu. Go to Settings, Shortcuts, and Window tab, and then you can set up a preset for that. By default, I believe it is Alt D. I don't know why you would need to use that. Generally speaking, I just leave Dscan up at all times, but you know, you're going to need to play around with it and experiment to see what works best for you. So, as you can see, when you first open this, if you're just getting started in the game, you're probably going to see something that looks like this. It's the system window, and it's also going to have the directional scanner window inside of it. You can undock this. There's a little button with a big square, big hollow square with a solid square inside of it. You just hit that. It's going to undock it, and you can drag and move it around wherever you want it. I keep mine in the lowest right corner of my screen at all times, and that works really well for me. It's out of the way, but it's still visible, and I can see it at all times, regardless of what I'm doing. Be sure that you don't cover up other windows, especially not your overview. In my example here, we have the Dscan right in the middle with the overview just below, and we've got a few other things in there. I don't know why you would want it set up with this way, but this is the way that the person who took this screenshot made it. That's the way they like it. You can play around with your own and see what works best for you. I don't think you would need the directional scanner to be this big, but if that's what works for you, that's what works for you. So play around with it. If you need inspiration, all of you Unistas, everyone in Eve University has access to our forums, and you can find a thread specifically for looking at different people's setups so that you can get an idea of how to organize your windows if you need some inspiration. As I said, the directional scanner is determined by your active overview filters. This is a setting in the directional scanner window itself. So where you see a number filtered, you can hit the down arrow, and it'll bring down a drop down menu, and you can select which of your presets you want to set. By default, it's going to be active overview filters. That means that everything that you see on your overview is going to show up on your Dscan, with a few exceptions. We'll get to that in a minute, but it's going to show everything that your overview shows. If you are using Eve University's overview setup, which every member of Eve University should be using, okay, it's very important that you use the Eve University overview setup. If you have that set up, you have access to Dscan specific settings. These Dscan specific settings allow you to see things that are important for defensive, offensive, and general purpose. Um, if you are using another overview setup, you may have access to those. Otherwise, I strongly recommend just using the active overview filters unless you know of a specific preset that works best for you. Play around with it, experiment with it, um, get comfortable with something that works, and be familiar with what shows up on Dscan, right? Because that's gonna save you in times of trouble, right? Your Dscan goes off automatically when you jump into a new system. So this might be jumping a Stargate or jumping a wormhole. When you use a filament, things like that, your Dscan is going to pop off automatically. It's that sound. You hear the boom. That's your Dscan going off, right? You obviously can use it as many times as you need to get a sense of what's around you. It's going to bring up everything that's accessible, everything that would show up on your overview, with a few exceptions. Now, unlike your overview, Dscan does not differentiate between friend and foe. So, you might see that there's a coercer on Dscan, but you don't know if that coercer is friendly or hostile. This is why it is important to be in standing fleet and in comms, because you can ask, hey, is that a friendly coercer I see on Dscan in whatever system you're in, right? Um, I know it may not seem like a big deal, but if you are in lowsec or nullsec or wormhole space, being able to ask these things is super important. And there are techniques to make this easier for identifying friend and foe just based on what you see on Dscan, but being able to ask in standing fleet, being able to ask in comms is super useful. So everyone in Eve University is strongly encouraged to be in standing fleet, be in comms. if you're going to be out in space. Now, your directional scanner works in tandem with your system map, right? That's the thing that shows up by default when you first open up your directional scanner. It is important to know what a few of these buttons are. Now, my screenshots are a little old, so the images might look slightly different, but it's mostly the same. You can open your system map, right, with the little button here, um, and that's going to pull up the system map. And on your system map, you're going to see this big green ball, and that is the range of your Dscan. That changes based on what you have your settings. So at 14.3 AU, the maximum range of your Dscan, it's going to be a giant big green ball. If you have it set to 1 AU, it's going to be a tiny little green ball. If you've changed the angle from 360 to, say, 90, it's going to look like a cone. Um, you will know where you are, not just because there's the green ball, but also because there is a little X or crosshair in the system map that shows where you are. Around it should be that green ball indicating your range of your Dscan. Now you can use this to compare with different objects on the map, right? So for example, in this screenshot I have PC9, right, which tells me that where all the stargates are, where the planets and moons are, and I can see that my Dscan covers a certain number of planets and moons. It covers a couple structures. I can see all of that on my Dscan. It's showing up on the Dscan here. But if I were to warp to one of the, say, the JH TAC gate, then I would no longer see the stuff that I was seeing before. I'm going to see other things. What I want to bring your attention to here is that there are a number of different settings that you can play around with in the Dscan and system map, particularly the system map and the way it interacts with the Dscan. I'm not going to go over all of this because it is tedious and not particularly, I don't find it particularly useful. You might, and that's why I'm going to say play around with it, but just be aware that the tools that you have at your disposal in the system map affect your ability to use the directional scanner and vice versa. So play around with some of these features, test out what these buttons do. A couple of them allow you to snap your camera within the system map. You can focus on what you are descanning, these kinds of things. Um, but play around with these settings, figure out what works for you, what you like to use. Some of them might be helpful. I think they are too unreliable and finicky to be something that I use regularly, but you might find a use for them depending on your play style. Now, as I mentioned, you can adjust the range. The maximum is 14.3 AU, but you can use a sliding scale or manually input the distance that you would like to use. You can also use the scroll wheel, which will allow you to change the range. And that will be reflected in the system map if you have it open. The uh, giant green ball is going to shrink to a smaller green ball, or if it's already a smaller green ball, it's going to balloon into a big green ball, unless you have the angle changed as well, in which case it will more than likely appear as a cone. And here you can see an example going from the 360 to an angle of, I think that's 60 degrees there. So we have a nice 60-degree cone. And why would you want to do this? Well, because with a cone, you can point it in a direction and get a sense of what is in that direction. And with your radial menu, you can click on an object in your system map and point it and descan in that direction. Simple as that. Now, you can also do that with your default scan button. Whatever scan button you have, you can click, you can hold down the scan button and click in the direction that you want to scan. If it's at an object, for example, on your system map, do be aware that planets will not show up on your Dscan, so you can still click on planets, but they won't show up on your Dscan. But if there are objects in the vicinity of your Dscan, those will show up. So again, this is something you're going to want to play around with and practice on your own. Um, if this were a class that I was teaching with live students, we would undock and experiment with this. But lately, I've been teaching a lot of impromptu classes, and so I haven't been able to gather everybody together to teach the practical aspect of this. So what I will say is, once you're done watching this, undock, play around with the Dscan settings, and if you run into problems, go ahead and leave me a comment uh, on this video, and I will try to respond to any questions that you have, try to clear up any confusion. I know this is a lot of information. Fortunately, since this is a video, you can go back and refer to different parts of the video, maybe pause it, take a look at the screenshots a little more closely, whatever you need to do to get comfortable. Just play around with those settings, play around with those angles and those ranges, and really get comfortable with using it. I will tell you, it takes a lot of practice. I am still practicing using Dscan. I am a C5 wormholer on my main, and I still have things to learn about using Dscan effectively. Now, I've covered most of this, but I will say that the cone is always going to be facing away from you. You do not need to move your ship in order to change the direction of the directional scan when you have it set to an angle. So you see a cone in the system map. Um, you can simply change the camera angle in the system map. And you can also, as I said before, you can use the radial menu or hold down your scan button, click on an object in the system map to automatically snap the camera to that direction, which will then change the direction of your D-scan cone, right? The direction that you're scanning with your cone. Now, as I mentioned towards the beginning, you can use Dscan as a defensive and offensive tool. Um, and this goes for everybody, right? Especially in the defensive sense. Um, Miners, explorers, everybody can use Dscan, and everybody should be at least comfortable with the basics of Dscan. You should figure out how you want to use Dscan, even if you don't think you're going to be using it often, even if you're not interested in PvP or wormhole life, that's okay. But you should be comfortable with the basics and you should be familiar with how Dscan works, and you should feel familiar with what you like with your Dscan settings. Dscan can be used defensively to see ships coming. As I hinted at earlier, if you see a hostile courser on Dscan, you know that there might be trouble. This is especially true if you're trying to, say, harvest gas in low sec or null sec, right? Or maybe you're wormhole diving, trying to get some of that valuable wormhole gas. Your Dscan can save your life, because if ships show up on your Dscan, that is advance warning of a potential threat. Combat probes will also show up on Dscan, and you can get a sense of how close those combat probes are and know that it is time to leave. This is why I say Dscan is for everyone. You can also use it offensively, and this is for everyone who's interested in PvP, right? You can use it as a part of your locating. Remember that you can use Dscan as much as you want, and nobody else knows that you're using Dscan. Nobody can see that you're scanning it. They can't see your settings unless you're streaming. They're not gonna know. So it is a good idea, if you want to be a scout or a hunter, that you get super familiar with Dscan, especially using Dscan at an angle and being able to pinpoint ships at different locations on the system map. Because if you can narrow down where a ship is using Dscan, that means you don't have to have your combat probes out for nearly as long. The longer combat probes are out, the more likely it is your your target will notice those combats and respond by running away or calling for help. If you are using Dscan defensively, you're going to want to have it set to 360 at 14.3 AU, your max range. This is going to allow you to see everything around you at all potential threats. Uh, do pay attention to your system map. Notice whether there are stargates or wormholes outside of your Dscan range, because that is a potential for a threat to sneak up on you. So be aware of that. The way to get around that is to be descanning for combat probes, or even core probes if you're at, say, a gas site, right? Be scanning constantly. Like I said at the beginning, you're going to want to set up your descan button so that you can push it constantly, easily, right? Constantly and easily be able to push your descan button. I did say at the top that you can't see cloaked ships, but as you see on my presentation here, cloaked ships have to decloak when switching from gate cloak to their covops cloak. They also have to decloak when they get within a certain distance of stargates, wormholes, and any other physical object in space, such as a structure. Be aware of this, because this is an opportunity to catch a cloaky ship decloaked on your Dscan. And we mostly talked about offensive use of Dscan. Um, what I want to point out to you is that you can combine, pinpointing with a lot of common sense. If you see an epithal out in space on Dscan, you can narrow it down to things like a customs office, right? So just point it at different planets, and you know if you see it at planet 9, it's a pretty safe bet that Epithal is probably at the customs office, right? It's either at the customs office or it's undocked on the structure, right? Covetors, Mackinaws, your orcas, porpoise, those things are going to be on a belt, they're going to be on an ore site, or they're going to be um, on an Athenor's moon, right? So use your Dscan, adjust your angle appropriately, and then use some informed decision making to narrow down based on what kind of target you are going after. And since this is a recorded class, not a live class with any students watching, if you have questions, please leave those as a comment. Otherwise, like, subscribe, maybe hit the bell notification to be notified when my next class video comes out or any other EVE Online content I put out comes out. I will try to get to any questions that are dropped in the comments as as quickly as possible, and I'll try to answer as many as possible. Can't promise to answer all of them, but otherwise, I wish you all the best. Fly safe.